Hi, Brian. We've caught you just as you've finished an event at Oxford University.
Yes,
For
sir.
our audience, could you introduce yourself and your work, please?
Absolutely. Um, so thanks again for having me, Jonathan. My name is Brian Kwoba. I am an associate professor of history and director of African and African American studies at the University of Memphis. I uh, I was in the UK back from 2013 to 2016, working on my doctoral degree in history, which became the book that I am now back in the UK to present. So it's a full circle moment in that sense to come back to the place where this book began as a doctoral thesis. I'm really excited to be back, and I've been involved in a lot of different activism over the years. And one of the things I did at Oxford was I was active in the Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford movement to decolonize education.
That movement from back then has reverberated in such powerful and wide-reaching ways that you wouldn't
Mm.
believe because it struck at the heart of a talismanic um, institution and a talismanic figure to
Right.
many. And it was
Right.
to anybody who knows the history, it's a no-brainer. Rhodes must fall. It stands on the actions and merits of the man himself and what he did. But to those who are in Britain, many people are ignorant about their real history and they have these figures and they don't necessarily know the full extent of their actions and their deeds and what they did. But they know who they are, and sometimes they just hang as these lights that we sort of arrange our national self-identity around.
Right.
But what I wanted to ask you was about the book that came from this PhD research that ended up as this book here. So Hubert Harrison, and could you tell us about Hubert Harrison and what we're going to find in the book and his position with like Pan-Africanism and left-wing politics in America in the early part of the 20th century, 1920s, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Hubert Harrison he lived from 1883 to 1927. He was born in the Caribbean, the island of St. Croix, what's now part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he becomes an orphan as a teenager and moves to New York in 1900 um, as part of a wave of Caribbean migrants to the U.S., right? Folks who are seeking better jobs and life prospects. And he's really shocked by what he sees in the US, particularly the system of Jim Crow segregation and the violent white supremacy and terrorism of lynching, where white mobs literally would, string black people up in a tree, executing them, in an extrajudicial manner for various different perceived slights against the white community. And so Harrison, he becomes very a critical thinker because, he breaks with the church and with religion. He sees all these white Christians, lynching black people, and he's like, okay, what is this church thing that's going on? He becomes a free thinker. He also declares himself an untamed and untamable African at a time when they were literally placing Africans in the zoo, as in the case of the Congolese man Otabanga, who gets put in the Bronx Zoo. And Harrison, he's also reacting to the Gilded Age of the robber barons, where you have these massive monopolists like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, who have really gotten rich by exploiting the labor of working people in the steel mills and in coal mines and so on and so forth. And so Harrison becomes a socialist. He's looking at the economic inequality in society, and he himself had a humble background, being born of plantation workers in the Caribbean, and so he identifies with the people, with the working class. He joins the Socialist Party, and he makes his own unique contributions as a black socialist, theorizing the relationship between race and class and sort of developing what we might think of as a kind of black Marxism, but also founding the Colored Socialist Club, which is the first official black-led party formation designed to recruit black workers and black organizers to the Socialist Party. And unfortunately, the party doesn't really want to hear what he is saying. And he's trying to get them to take black workers seriously, to sort of devote special attention to questions of racial oppression, lynching, segregation, Jim Crow, and all the rest of it. And they kind of poo-poo that and sweep him under the rug. And so he ends up leaving the Socialist Party and he founds the Liberty League of Negro Americans, which is this sort of Pan-Africanist organization that has African Caribbeans and African Americans brought together in the same organization in ways that hadn't been done before. So when Marcus Garvey comes to New York, he joins Harrison's Liberty League, and it's in Harrison's Liberty League that Garvey develops the race first doctrine that would become so central to Garveyism, that he adopts an internationalist sort of politics, supporting the struggles of colonized peoples all over the world. And that Garvey also, has the idea of a flag. The Liberty League had this tricolor black, brown, and yellow flag, which influences the Garvey flag, the red, black, and green, which remains a symbol of sort of Pan-African unity and sovereignty to this day. And so Harrison has a massive impact on the rise of Garvey and Garveyism. And also Harrison becomes critical of Garvey in terms of Garvey's authoritarian behavior, his financial mismanagement, Garvey's dreams for a black empire over which the sun would never set. Harrison, was an anti-imperialist. He called for a colored international against capitalist imperialism rather than building a black version of capitalist imperialism. And so, yeah, so Harrison, he has all these interesting sort of influences and impacts, and he gets written out of history in part because the criticism that he makes of the Socialist Party, for example, means that they write him out of their history. The criticisms that he makes of Marcus Garvey means that the Garvey movement writes him out of their history, and so on and so forth. We could say the same about the Harlem Renaissance sort of narrative and framework of reference for this period. And so he's this fascinating figure who is massively influential and important in his time, and then almost equally massively disremembered and forgotten and marginalized after he dies. And so that's why I wrote this book, is to sort of reclaim his legacy. I think of it as a work of ancestral reclamation for this groundbreaking figure in the Black radical tradition who has so much to teach us and so much we can learn from today, given that, Harrison was dealing with a lot of the same systems that are still with us now when it comes to capitalism and imperialism and, all the rest of it.
Can you tell me about his outdoor universities, and particularly situate that in the conflict that often exists between an intellectual black tradition of radicalism and how that manifests at a street level? Like, how do those ideas get transmitted into a wider populace? Because that was something that clearly happened at that time, and
Yeah.
is something that sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't, in the course of Black
Yeah.
Atlantic politics.
Absolutely. So, the way that Black educational debate is usually framed in the early 20th century is between the sort of industrial education of the Booker T. Washingtons of the world, which is basically sort of a trade school type of education, versus the liberal arts tradition of a W.E.B. Du Bois, right, who went to Harvard and had a more of a sort of what we think of as like a university type education. Harrison was doing something completely different from both of them. Harrison was a pioneer in the art of street corner speaking, and he would literally get on a stepladder outdoors at the corner of 135th and Lenox and a number of other locations in Harlem, and he would literally speak to audiences large enough to block traffic on a whole range of subjects. Harrison had a sort of genius level intellect and this voracious appetite for reading and for knowledge. Somebody once asked him, how many books he reads a day. He said, "Oh, 5 or 6." And the thing about it is he would share his knowledge with the people. Like, he literally believed that people who had knowledge or who had intellectual capacities needed to come down from the sort of ivory towers and actually share that knowledge with the people, engage with people, right? And so some Harlem residents called his method of education this way, the outdoor university, because the level of knowledge that he was sharing and discussing was so high, but this was outdoors. And so I have a whole chapter in my book called the Outdoor Grioversity, because there's a West African sort of griot-like element to what he's doing in terms of the call and response, right? In terms of the oral tradition and culture of African people, including West Africans, from whom Harrison would have descended, and I think, there's this interesting way that he's able to kind of remix and reimagine what is possible for education of, by, and for the people, right? Of, by, and for the grassroots, as opposed to just a talented 10th that are able to get into the Harvards and Oxfords of the world on the one hand, or a kind of basic level trade school, education for jobs only type of approach that the industrial advocates of education and the industrial education advocates were pushing. I mean, this is a whole new model of education that we have to reckon with, because I think even nowadays we see how a lot of the institutions are corrupt and aren't teaching history and politics and culture the way that they should be, right? And in terms of really grappling with the key problems of the day.
Can you talk about your, because obviously you've come back, so we're speaking to you, like you said, you're at Oxford University, and this is where you did some postgrad studies, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Can you talk about what you knew about, you weren't a Rhodes Scholar, were you?
No, I wasn't.
No. All right, just checking. All right, that's fine. Um, can you tell me what you knew about Rhodes before you got there? What sort of sparked your journey towards getting involved with that activism, and a bit more about that?
So, I knew Rhodes pretty well because Cecil Rhodes was sort of like the archetype British colonizer, right? I mean, he's somebody after whom countries were named. Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, were named after Rhodes, right? The countries that became Zambia and Zimbabwe after independence. That's how big a colonizer he was in Southern Africa. And so when I got to Oxford, we saw that there was this massive Black student movement emerging at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, because Rhodes, had all these mines, these diamond mines in South Africa, and founded the De Beers, diamond company, which remains to this day one of the biggest players in the diamond industry. He got rich exploiting the labor of Southern Africans, and he would use some of that wealth to endow different universities. So he gave a chunk to the University of Cape Town, which is why there used to be a big statue of Cecil Rhodes at UCT in South Africa. He gave a big chunk of money to Oriel College right here in Oxford, where I'm sitting at the moment, because Rhodes himself was an alumnus of Oriel College. And that's why there's a statue of Cecil Rhodes on the facade of Oriel College to this day. And so when we saw, and I had the year before Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford, I had helped co-found the Oxford Pan-African Forum, which was a space designed to kind of foster conversations about Pan-Africanism and draw in African Caribbean, African American, and continental African students into a space where we could sort of begin to reckon with the sort of oppressive nature of the university, right? As a place that was pretty hostile to the kind of Black liberation politics that I was interested in when I arrived. And so when we saw the thing popping off at UCT with Rhodes, we're looking at ourselves like, well, we have a statue of Rhodes right here in Oxford. And so we initially did a solidarity protest, almost like saying, we support you, UCT. But that very quickly grew into our very own Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford, because not only is there a Rhodes statue in Oxford, there's also the Cecil Rhodes House, where Rhodes scholars, are based, where the Rhodes Scholarship is based. Again, a scholarship that was endowed with money exploited from the labor of Southern Africans. And we had Black Rhodes scholars in the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Ntokozo Kwabe, for example, who was also an alumnus of UCT and then had become a Rhodes Scholar. He was quite familiar with both settings of Rhodes, and a very powerful voice in our movement, because when they tried to say, oh, like, how can you criticize Rhodes when you're on a Rhodes Scholarship? He was like, look, this money was exploited from the labor of my ancestors. The fact that a small drop of it comes back to me in the form of a scholarship doesn't even begin to cover what was taken out of Africa in terms of the wealth that Rhodes brought out. Never mind repairing the damage, right? Never mind, we're not even talking about reparations. We're not even talking about breaking even, right? We're just talking about a little trickle that has come back to one individual from a whole history of, colonial exploitation.
And you would say, it's obviously the purpose of these Rhodes scholarships, and at some point, was to shape the thinking classes of decolonized nations, to sort of steer
Absolutely.
them. to keep them within the traditions that one would expect from this country?
I mean, yes, but not even decolonized nations, because the vast, vast, vast overwhelming majority of Rhodes Scholarship recipients historically has been white men. I mean, the scholarship, for example, did not even allow women until the 70s. So there were no women Rhodes Scholars until the 70s. And that's the first, 7/10 of its existence as a scholarship. Similarly, African Americans, there was one African American, Alain Locke, who was a Rhodes Scholar in the early 1900s. But after Locke, we don't see another Black Rhodes Scholar until the 60s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And so again, the scholarship has historically been white and male overwhelmingly. That has changed a little bit in recent years as they've started to, diversify the pool of applicants that they allow for the scholarship. But in Rhodes's will, if you look at his will, he's very clear about who he wants the scholarships to go to. He wants it going to young white men who have colonial ambitions and a kind of imperial mindset like Rhodes himself had.
Because it became a high profile thing. Did you anticipate that that would be what it would become, or was that not necessarily part of your understanding of what it would be? Like pushback, because there is always
Yeah.
institutional
Yeah.
pushback.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of sister movements, as we might call them, in other institutions around the UK and around the world. But because Oxford is Oxford, right, and it does have a certain kind of visibility in terms of being the quote unquote pinnacle of the British education system and what have you. Obviously, that meant that there was a spotlight on what we were doing that a lot of the other colleges and universities didn't necessarily have. And so I think what we tried to do is try to use as best we could to use that to our advantage, right? To use the platform, the microphone that being at Oxford and doing a decolonizing movement in Oxford affords, right? I mean, we're really in the belly of the beast, as I said earlier. Oxford and Cambridge together, Oxbridge are really the sort of intellectual training ground for the British ruling class. And so if you want to shake things up here, it's going to have reverberations, right? It's going to draw a reaction. And student organizers like Ntokozo, who I mentioned, the Black South African Rhodes Scholar, he got a lot of flack in the British media. I mean, I feel bad sometimes when I think about those days and how I wish I could have shown up more for him, and made sure that we all sort of. I mean, he's strong, so he managed well, but it was pretty hostile in terms of the British media response, right? Because they don't want to deal with empire. They don't want to deal with British imperialism and the legacy of empire and slavery and colonization, the rest of it. They want to just kind of whitewash that whole period or invent justifications and explanations for why it was a good thing, And so yeah, we faced a real uphill battle. I remember the vice chancellor of the university, for example, saying, "Well, if students don't like the architecture, maybe they should study elsewhere," which was a kind of a shocking response because, in the US, for example, when we call for the Confederate statues to come down, which are similarly monuments to white supremacy, um, people at least understand why you would make that case. They don't pretend like, oh, you're just crazy or you should go elsewhere if you have a problem with Confederate statues. And so it was a really instructive sort of experience for me to understand how sensitive and what a sensitive nerve the question of the British Empire is when you touch that nerve. But also how important it is to do so, given that, British imperialism is not a thing of the past, but in fact an ongoing reality when you look at, the British with the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the genocide in Gaza, right? I mean, Britain is complicit in all these things. And so I think that's the other reason why they don't want to have this conversation, because it's not just a historical or intellectual conversation. It's a conversation about British foreign policy today.
Brian, it's been lovely to talk to you and just hear a bit about what you're doing today. Could you
Mhm.
please, I know you've got the picture there behind you, but could you please also tell people where they can get the book, and, you know, like reference it again for us, just in case anyone missed it at the top.
Absolutely. And while I do that, if I may, I'm just going to share a graphic because I'm on a book tour, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm on a UK book tour, and so what I want to do is just show. I'll just put it on the screen. Hopefully you can see what I'm sharing here.
It is
Uh,
now visible.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so this is my tour. I just came to Oxford from Belfast, where I was yesterday, Queen's University, Belfast. Had a great session there. Today I was at the University of Oxford. Tomorrow I'll be at a community event in Oxford, and then from there I go on next week to Sussex, Brighton, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Strathclyde, London, and Birmingham. And so, yeah, I'm really excited. I've been working on this book for over a decade, you know, and it's more than just a book, you know, it's a piece of my heart and soul. I've poured myself into this work to reclaim this ancestral figure in Hubert Harrison, you know, again, one of these kind of trailblazers in the Black radical tradition, someone who was a free lover, a free thinker, a socialist, a radical anti-imperialist and Pan-Africanist, and who has a lot to teach us, you know, to still to this day. One simple example that I often share in my book talks is that at the very same time that you know people were putting Africans in the zoo, like in the Bronx Zoo, right next door to where Harrison was in Harlem, New York, Harrison was identifying himself as an untamed, untamable African. And I just find that such a refreshing sort of reclaiming of African identity and heritage, right? To think of oneself as an untamed, untamable African in a world that would try to tame us, that would try to neuter us, that would try to, you know, tone us down and make us assimilate into a kind of white supremacist, capitalist, toxic, patriarchal social order. So yeah, if you know anybody in any of these places that I just mentioned or that I have up on the screen, would love to, you know, I would invite you to to invite them to one of my upcoming book events. And I'm on Instagram as well at Dr. Kwoba. That's dr.kwoba. One other thing I can say, hopefully it's on the screen here. You see, I won the 2026 Frantz Fanon Outstanding Book Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association, which is a massive honor and speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of my book, which, although it's a work of history, it also has appeal to philosophers, to sociologists, to political science people, to literary people. There's a lot of sort of ins and outs and dimensions of the book, and I think it has a broad appeal. So yeah.
Well, perfect. I know I'll be at one of the London events, and definitely I'll be sharing this, and I'll advise everyone to come and find out more. Dr. Kwoba, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. This has been great, and I hope to see some of your audience at book events.